Mom, you're 70 years old with arthritis. What retirement plans? You'll be living with us forever because you have nothing. My son Marcus laughed at dinner, dismissing me like I was a confused child. What Marcus didn't know was that while he was planning my permanent dependence, I was planning my complete disappearance. And the $2.8 million he thought didn't exist was about to vanish along with me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Blackwood. I'm 70 years old. 3 months ago, I became a ghost. Halti. Not the kind that haunts houses, the kind that haunts people who underestimated her. The kind that leaves behind empty bank accounts and grown children who suddenly realize they never knew their mother at all. Marcus is still looking for me. So is my daughter Rebecca. They've hired private investigators. They've contacted banks. They've called every friend I ever mentioned. What they haven't done is apologize for treating me like a burden. What they haven't done is acknowledge that their mother might have been smarter than they assumed. Let me tell you about the dinner that changed everything. The dinner where my son decided my future without consulting me. The dinner that cost him more than he could have imagined. It was a Tuesday evening in March. Marcus had invited me to his house in Westfield for what he called a family meeting. Rebecca drove down from Boston. Both my children sat across from me at Marcus's dining room table like I was applying for a job. "Mom," Marcus began, using the tone people reserve for elderly relatives they think are losing their minds. "Rebecca and I have been talking. We're worried about you living alone." I had been living alone for 8 years. Since my husband Robert died of cancer, I'd managed just fine, paid my bills, maintained my small house in Millbrook, kept my independence. "What kind of worried?" I asked. "You're getting older," Rebecca chimed in. "The house is too big. The stairs are dangerous. You shouldn't be driving at your age." I was 70, not 90. My reflexes were fine. My mind was sharp. But my children had apparently decided I was one step away from assisted living. "We've been looking at options," Marcus continued. "There's a really nice senior community about 20 minutes from here, much safer than living alone." "I don't want to move to a senior community," I said calmly. Marcus laughed. Not a kind laugh. The laugh you give someone whose opinion doesn't matter. "Mom, you don't really have a choice here. You can't afford to keep living independently. Your Social Security barely covers basic expenses." That's when I made my first mistake. I tried to explain that I had other resources, that I wasn't as helpless as they assumed. "Actually, I've been working on some retirement plans." Marcus cut me off with that laugh, the laugh that sealed his fate. "Mom, you're 70 years old with arthritis. What retirement plans? You'll be living with us forever, because you have nothing." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "Marcus is right, Mom. You need to be realistic about your situation." My situation. As if I were a problem to be solved, rather than their mother who'd raised them with love and sacrifice. "I've been investing," I said quietly. "There are some things you don't know about." "Investing?" Marcus nearly choked on his wine. "Mom, what investments? Your little savings account at First National? The $20,000 Dad left you?" $20,000. They thought that was all I had. They thought their father had left me practically nothing. They thought I'd been scraping by on Social Security and their occasional charity. "There might be more than you realize," I said. "Like what?" Rebecca asked with barely concealed impatience. "Mom, we've seen your bank statements when we helped with Dad's estate. There's nothing there." They'd seen one bank statement, from one account. At one bank, they'd assumed it was everything. "Rebecca, I could surprise you," I said. That's when Marcus really started laughing. Deep, dismissive laughter that echoed through his expensive dining room. "Surprise us how? Mom, you worked part-time at the library for 15 years. Dad handled all the finances. You've never made a significant financial decision in your life." "You don't know everything about my life," I said. "We know enough," Rebecca said. "Mom, you're living in a fantasy. There are no secret investments. There's no hidden money. You're broke and you need help." Marcus leaned forward like he was explaining math to a child. "Ioani, here's what's going to happen. You're going to sell the house." We'll use whatever equity there is to pay for the senior community. Rebecca and I will handle your finances from now on. No more pretending you can take care of yourself. Handle my finances. No more pretending I could take care of myself. And if I refuse? I asked. Marcus exchanged a look with Rebecca. A look that said they'd already discussed this scenario. Then we'll have to explore other options, Marcus said. Legal options. Guardianship. Power of attorney. Whatever it takes to keep you safe. Guardianship. They were threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't agree to their plan. You can't be serious, I said. We're completely serious, Rebecca said. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Maybe it's early dementia. Maybe it's just age. But you can't keep pretending you have options you don't have. Early dementia. Because I'd mentioned having retirement plans they didn't know about. I think I should go home, I said, standing up from the table. Mom, sit down, Marcus said firmly. We're not done here. Yes, we are, I said. This conversation is over. No, it's not, Rebecca said. Mom, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you. Help me. By taking away my independence and treating me like an incompetent child. I walked to the front door. Marcus followed me. Mom, don't be stubborn about this. You know we're right. I turned to look at my son, this man I'd raised from birth. This man whose college education I'd helped pay for. This man who was now threatening to have me declared incompetent. Marcus, I said quietly, you have no idea who you're dealing with. He laughed again. That same dismissive laugh that would haunt him for months. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a 70-year-old woman who can't accept reality. I left his house that night knowing our relationship would never be the same. Not because of what they wanted me to do, but because of how they'd spoken to me. How they'd dismissed me. How they'd reduced me to a problem to be managed. What Marcus and Rebecca didn't understand was that their mother hadn't been sitting idle for 8 years since their father died. I hadn't been pining away in my little house, depending on their occasional visits and charity. Good. I'd been busy, very busy, good, but I'd been quiet about it. Because Robert had always handled our public finances. Because I'd learned that people made assumptions about widows. Because I discovered that being underestimated could be a powerful advantage. For 8 years, I'd let my children think I was helpless. I'd let them believe their father had left me with almost nothing. I'd smiled politely when they brought me groceries I didn't need and offered financial advice I didn't require. I'd played the role of the dependent widow because it was easier than explaining what I'd really been doing with my time. But that night, driving home from Marcus's house, I realized the game was over. My children had shown me exactly how little they respected me. They'd threatened to take away my freedom if I didn't comply with their plans. They'd laughed at the idea that I might have resources they didn't know about. They'd treated me like a burden rather than their mother. It was time to stop playing the helpless widow. It was time to show them who Eleanor Blackwood really was. When I got home that night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list. A strategy list. At the top, I wrote, "How to disappear completely." Because that's what I was going to do. I was going to vanish so thoroughly that Marcus and Rebecca would spend the rest of their lives wondering how they'd been so wrong about their mother. I was going to take every penny of the money they didn't think existed and disappear to a place they'd never find me. And I was going to let them explain to their friends and neighbors how they'd lost track of a 70-year-old woman with arthritis who supposedly had no money and no options. But first, I needed to tell you how I'd built what they didn't know existed. How a part-time library worker had accumulated enough wealth to disappear completely. How a woman they thought was helpless had been planning her freedom for almost a decade. The story begins 37 years ago, when I was 33 years old and married to an accountant who thought his wife was too simple to understand money. Robert Blackwood was a good man in many ways. He loved our children. He provided for our family. He never cheated or drank or gambled away our security. But Robert had old-fashioned ideas about marriage. He believed men handled money and women handled houses. He believed financial decisions were too complicated for wives to understand. For the first 15 years of our marriage, I accepted this arrangement. I raised Marcus and Rebecca. I kept house. I let Robert manage our finances while I focused on being the perfect wife and mother. But in 1987, something happened that changed everything. Robert had a minor heart attack. Nothing serious, but it required a week in the hospital and several weeks of recovery at home. While he was recovering, I had to handle our day-to-day finances for the first time in our marriage. Paying bills, managing bank accounts, dealing with insurance claims. That's when I discovered Robert wasn't as good with money as he'd always claimed. Our savings account had barely $3,000. We were carrying credit card debt I didn't know existed. Robert had been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years, moving money between accounts to create the illusion of financial stability. We weren't poor, but we weren't secure either. Despite Robert's good salary and careful public image, we were living paycheck to paycheck like millions of other families. "It's temporary," Robert assured me when I asked about our finances. "I've had some unexpected expenses. Everything will be fine once I get back to work." But I'd seen the bank statements. I'd talked to the insurance company. I'd added up our debts and compared them to our income. Yes, we weren't fine. We were one major expense away from serious financial trouble. That's when I made a decision that would change the rest of my life. I decided to start learning about money myself, not to challenge Robert's authority, but to protect our family's future. I started small. I checked out books about investing from the library where I worked part-time. I read articles about personal finance. I watched the financial news during my lunch breaks. What I discovered was that money management wasn't nearly as complicated as Robert had always claimed. Basic investing principles were logical and straightforward. With time and patience, almost anyone could build wealth. But I also discovered something else, something that would become the foundation of everything I built over the next 30 years. But I discovered that being invisible could be an advantage. Nobody pays attention to part-time library workers. Nobody assumes that quiet wives have financial ambitions. Nobody imagines that women who bake cookies for school fundraisers might also be studying investment strategies. I could learn about money without anyone noticing. I could start investing without anyone caring. I could build wealth quietly while everyone assumed I was just Robert's simple wife. In 1988, I opened my first investment account, not at the bank where Robert did business, but at a different institution across town. I used my maiden name, Eleanor Mitchell. I started with $200, money I'd saved from my library salary. Money Robert didn't know about because he'd never asked about my earnings. $200 wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Over the next year, I added small amounts whenever I could. $20 here, $50 there. Money from returned Christmas gifts. Money from selling things we didn't need. By the end of 1988, my secret account had grown to nearly $800, not through spectacular gains, but through consistent contributions and basic index fund investing. Robert never noticed. Why would he? I was still the same wife who packed his lunches and attended PTA meetings. I still deferred to his financial decisions and nodded when he explained why we couldn't afford things I wanted. But quietly, secretly, I was building something of my own. In 1989, I got more aggressive. I started a side business selling handmade crafts at local fairs and markets. Nothing fancy. Baby quilts, knitted scarves, holiday decorations. Robert thought it was a cute hobby. Eleanor's little craft business, he'd tell people. Something to keep me busy while he handled the real work of providing for our family. What Robert didn't realize was that my little craft business was generating $15,000 to $20,000 a year in profit. Money I was investing every single month in my secret account. I wasn't spending the craft money on household expenses or family vacations. I was treating it like a business and reinvesting every penny I earned. By 1995, when Marcus graduated from high school, my secret investments had grown to over $40,000. By 2000, when Rebecca finished college, I had nearly $90,000 in various accounts that Robert knew nothing about. I was 47 years old and had accidentally discovered I was good at making money, very good at it. But I was also careful, extremely careful. I never touched the money for personal expenses. I never mentioned my investments to anyone. I let Robert continue believing he was our family's sole financial provider. Because I'd learned something important during those years. People make assumptions about quiet women. They assume we're not ambitious. They assume we're not intelligent. They assume we're content to let others make decisions for us. These assumptions can be useful if you're smart enough to use them. Sapejska haladia. By 2010, when Robert was diagnosed with cancer, my secret investments had grown to over $300,000. I'd been building wealth for 22 years, while everyone assumed I was just a part-time library worker with no financial experience. During Robert's illness, I continued adding to my investments. Money from craft sales, money from my library salary, money from small inheritances from relatives who'd died over the years. Robert was too sick to pay attention to our finances. Marcus and Rebecca were focused on their own lives. Nobody was watching what Eleanor was doing with her hobby money. When Robert died in 2016, he left me the house and about $20,000 in savings. Exactly what Marcus and Rebecca saw when they helped settle his estate. What they didn't see was that I had accumulated over $400,000 in investments under my maiden name. Money Robert had never known about. Money my children had no reason to suspect existed. But I didn't stop there. After Robert's funeral, after my children returned to their own lives, I threw myself into investing with the focus I'd once devoted to raising them. I had advantages now that I'd never had before. No husband to question my decisions. No children living at home to notice my activities. Complete freedom to manage money however I chose. Hell odd. I studied the market like other people studied television shows. I researched companies like other people researched vacation destinations. I tracked my investments like other people tracked their favorite sports teams. And I kept making craft items, lots of them. I'd built a reputation over 20 years as someone who made beautiful, high-quality handmade goods. My customer base had grown beyond local fairs to include online sales and special orders. What had started as a cover story for my investing had become a legitimate business, generating over $30,000 a year in profit, all of which went straight into my investment accounts. By 2020, 4 years after Robert's death, I had accumulated over $800,000. By 2022, I'd crossed the $1 million mark. And still, nobody knew. Not Marcus, not Rebecca, not any of our family friends or neighbors. They all saw exactly what I wanted them to see: a widow living quietly on Social Security and her late husband's modest life insurance policy. A woman who needed their help and guidance to navigate the complicated world of finance. A woman who would be grateful for their charity and dependent on their generosity. They were wrong about all of it. By the time Marcus laughed at my retirement plans that Tuesday night in March, I had accumulated $2.8 million in various investment accounts. More money than Marcus made in 5 years at his corporate job. More money than Rebecca and her husband had in their savings and retirement accounts combined. More money than they'd ever imagined their simple mother could possess. But they'd never asked the right questions. They'd never wondered what I'd been doing with my time for 8 years. They'd never considered that a woman who'd successfully raised 2 children and managed a household for 30 years might also be capable of managing money. They'd made assumptions, and those assumptions were about to cost them everything they thought they were entitled to inherit. Nazir the Rabach, Nuschilinead de Bisan. Because the night Marcus laughed at me, I decided it was time to stop being invisible. It was time to show my children exactly what their mother was capable of when she stopped pretending to be helpless. It was time to disappear. To understand how Marcus and Rebecca's betrayal cut so deeply, you need to know where I came from. You need to understand the woman they dismissed wasn't born into comfort. I was forged by hardship, shaped by necessity, and strengthened by every obstacle life threw at me. My story begins 70 years ago in a cramped apartment above Murphy's hardware store in Millfield, Pennsylvania. The year was 1954. I was Eleanor Catherine Mitchell then, the oldest of 4 children in a family that survived on determination and very little else. My father, Thomas Mitchell, worked the coal mines when his back allowed it. My mother, Catherine, took in laundry and mending to stretch his irregular income. Our apartment had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and windows that never quite kept out the winter cold. I shared a bed with my 2 younger sisters, Mary and Susan. My brother Jimmy slept on the couch. Privacy was impossible. Quiet was a luxury we couldn't afford. The smell of coal dust and harsh soap seemed to live in our clothes no matter how often they were washed. But even in that crowded, uncertain environment, I learned lessons that would shape everything I did for the rest of my life. "Eleanor, you're different from the others," my mother would tell me as I helped her fold laundry for customers who paid 50 cents a basket. "You see things they don't see. You understand things they don't understand." What I understood, even as a child, was that poverty wasn't permanent unless you accepted it as permanent. That some families had nice houses and steady incomes because someone in that family had refused to settle for less. My mother had dreams she'd never been able to pursue. She'd wanted to be a teacher before she married my father at 17. She'd wanted to travel beyond the borders of our small Pennsylvania town. She'd wanted to read books and wear pretty clothes and live somewhere that didn't smell like coal dust. But circumstances had trapped her in a life that was smaller than her dreams. Marriage at 17. 4 children by the time she was 25. A husband whose injuries from mine work made him unpredictable and often angry. "I want something different for you girls," she'd whisper when we worked together in the evenings. "I want you to have choices I never had." Choices. The word became my obsession. I wanted to understand what created choices for some people, while others seemed trapped by circumstances beyond their control. School became my escape and my laboratory. While my siblings saw homework as another chore, I saw it as preparation for the choices I was going to create for myself. I studied by candlelight when we couldn't pay the electric bill. I walked 3 miles to the library on Saturdays to read books about places I'd never seen. I asked teachers questions about how the world worked beyond our small town. Eleanor Mitchell is an exceptional student, my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, told my mother during a parent conference. She has the potential to earn academic scholarships. She could attend college if she maintains her current performance. College. The word was as foreign and impossible as saying I might fly to the moon. Nobody in our family had finished high school, let alone attended college. But Mrs. Henderson spoke about my future with such confidence that even my mother began to believe it might be possible. "What would she study?" my mother asked, her work-worn hands folded carefully in her lap. "She shows remarkable aptitude for mathematics and business concepts," Mrs. Henderson replied. "She could pursue accounting, business management, or economics. All excellent careers for young women who are good with numbers." Business. Numbers. The idea fascinated me in ways I couldn't fully explain. I'd always been good at managing our household's limited resources. Figuring out how to stretch groceries for a week. Calculating how much laundry my mother needed to take in to pay the rent. Maybe those skills could translate into something bigger, something that would create the choices my mother had never had. From that day forward, I approached my education with the intensity of someone whose life depended on it. Because it did, academic success was my only path to a different kind of life. Arthritis. High school was challenging, but not because of the coursework. The academic material came easily. What was difficult was being the poor girl among classmates whose families had steady incomes and comfortable homes. I wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, carefully mended and pressed each night. I brought sandwiches made with day-old bread while other students bought lunch in the cafeteria. I worked part-time jobs after school to help with family expenses while my classmates participated in clubs and social activities. But I also excelled academically in ways that couldn't be ignored. Perfect grades in mathematics. Top scores on standardized tests. Teachers began mentioning college scholarships with increasing frequency. "Eleanor, I think you should apply to several universities," my guidance counselor, Mr. Patterson, told me during my junior year. "Your grades and test scores qualify you for academic scholarships that could cover tuition, room, and board. Full scholarships." The possibility of attending college without placing an impossible financial burden on my family. I spent my senior year applying for every scholarship I could find. Academic merit awards. Need-based grants. Essay competitions. Anything that might help pay for the education I was determined to obtain. In the spring of 1972, I received the letter that changed my life forever. Penn State University was offering me a full academic scholarship to study business administration. Tuition, room, board, and a small stipend for books and supplies. I would be the first person in my family to attend college. And it wouldn't cost my parents a single penny. Midulek? My mother cried when I showed her the letter. Not tears of sadness, but tears of pride and relief. "You did it," she whispered, holding the official document like it was made of gold. "You actually did it." Moving to Penn State in September 1972 was like emigrating to a foreign country. The campus was larger than my entire hometown. My dormitory room was cleaner and more comfortable than anywhere I'd ever lived. The dining halls served food I'd never tasted before. But what struck me most was the freedom. For the first time in my life, I could focus entirely on learning without worrying about family responsibilities or part-time jobs. The scholarship covered everything I needed. The coursework was demanding but fascinating. Accounting principles, business law, economics, marketing. Every class revealed new aspects of how money and business worked in the world beyond small-town Pennsylvania. But more than the academic knowledge, I was learning practical skills that would serve me for the rest of my life. How to analyze financial statements, how to evaluate investment opportunities, how to think strategically about long-term financial planning. During my sophomore year, I took an elective course called Personal Finance and Investment Strategies. The professor, Dr. Margaret Sullivan, was one of the few female business professors at Penn State. She became my mentor and, eventually, my role model. "Miss Mitchell," she told me after class one day, "you have an intuitive understanding of financial concepts that's quite rare. Have you considered specializing in investment management?" Investment management. I'd never heard of such a career. But Dr. Sullivan explained that it involved helping individuals and institutions make smart decisions about their money. "The field is still dominated by men," she said, "but that's changing. Women often bring a different perspective to financial planning. More conservative, more focused on long-term security rather than short-term gains." Under Dr. Sullivan's guidance, I dove into advanced courses in finance and investment theory. I learned about stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and real estate investing. I studied market trends and economic indicators. But most importantly, I learned that building wealth wasn't about earning a huge salary. It was about making smart decisions with whatever money you had. About living below your means and investing the difference. About thinking in terms of decades rather than months. "Wealth building is a marathon, not a sprint," Dr. Sullivan often said. "The people who get rich quick usually lose it just as quickly. The people who build lasting wealth do it slowly, steadily, and strategically." I graduated from Penn State in 1976 with highest honors and a degree in business administration with a concentration in finance. More importantly, I'd acquired knowledge that would allow me to create the choices my mother had dreamed about. My first job was as a junior accountant at Harrison & Associates, a small accounting firm in Millfield. Not because I wanted to return to my hometown, but because they offered me a position that would allow me to gain experience while staying close to my aging parents. The work was routine but valuable. Preparing tax returns for local businesses. Managing payroll for small companies. Helping clients understand basic financial planning concepts. But what I really learned during those 2 years was how little most people understood about money. Even business owners often made financial decisions based on emotion rather than logic. They spent money they didn't have on things they didn't need. They failed to plan for emergencies or retirement. Most people treat money like it's magic. My supervisor, George Harrison, observed one afternoon, as we discussed a client who'd gotten into financial trouble. They expect it to multiply without effort or disappear without consequences. I began to understand that financial literacy was a skill that could provide security and freedom. But it was also a skill that most people never learned, even those who earned good salaries. That's when I started thinking about my own future in more strategic terms. I was 24 years old, earning a modest but steady income, and living with my parents to save money. What did I want to accomplish over the next 10 years? I made a list of goals that seemed impossibly ambitious at the time. Build an emergency fund equal to 6 months of expenses. Start investing at least 20% of my income in diversified mutual funds. Save enough money to buy a house without going deeply into debt. Meet someone who shared my values about hard work and financial responsibility. Create a life that would provide security and choices for any children I might have. Those goals guided every financial decision I made over the next few years. I lived in a tiny apartment and drove a used car. I cooked my own meals and made my own clothes. I saved money that other people my age spent on entertainment and luxury items. But I wasn't miserable. I was building something. Every dollar I saved and invested was a step toward the freedom my mother had never achieved. By 1978, I'd accumulated nearly $8,000 in savings and investments. Not a fortune, but enough to feel secure. Enough to know that I was creating choices for myself. That's when I met Robert Blackwood. Robert was 2 years older than me, recently graduated from Penn State with an accounting degree. He'd taken a job with a larger firm in nearby Harrisburg and was looking for someone to share expenses on a small house he wanted to buy. We met through mutual friends from college. Robert was serious, responsible, and shared my belief that financial security was the foundation of a good life. He was also kind, funny, and treated me like an equal partner, rather than someone who needed to be protected or managed. "Eleanor," he said during one of our early conversations, "I've never met a woman who understands money the way you do. Most of the women I've dated think budgeting is something their husbands should handle." That attitude was exactly what attracted me to Robert. He didn't assume that men were naturally better with money. He didn't think wives should be excluded from financial decisions. He wanted a partner who could contribute to building something together. We started dating seriously in the fall of 1978. Within 6 months, we were discussing marriage and shared financial goals. Robert wanted to start his own accounting practice within 5 years. I wanted to continue investing until we had enough money to buy a nice house and start a family. "What do you think about this plan?" Robert asked one evening, showing me calculations he'd made about our combined financial future. "If we both keep working and saving aggressively, we could have everything we want by the time we're 30. Everything we wanted. A house, financial security, children, and the peace of mind that comes from making smart decisions with money." Robert proposed on Christmas Eve 1979, in the living room of the small house we'd been sharing for 6 months. It wasn't the most romantic setting in the world, but it represented something more important than romance. It represented partnership, shared values, and a commitment to building something meaningful together. "Eleanor," he said, getting down on one knee beside our tiny Christmas tree, "you're the smartest, most capable woman I've ever met. Will you marry me and help me build the kind of life we've both been dreaming about?" I said yes without hesitation. Not because I needed Robert to complete me, but because I'd found someone who complemented my strengths and shared my vision for the future. We were married in June 1980 in a small ceremony at the Methodist church where my family attended services. I wore a simple white dress I'd made myself. Robert wore the same suit he'd worn to his college graduation. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, with food I'd prepared and decorations we'd made together. It wasn't elaborate or expensive, but it was perfect because it reflected who we were. Two people who valued substance over style, planning over impulse, and long-term security over short-term gratification. Our honeymoon was a long weekend in the Pocono Mountains. We couldn't afford an expensive trip, but we didn't care. We were too excited about starting our life together to worry about traditions we couldn't afford. When we returned from our honeymoon, Robert and I sat down at our kitchen table and planned our future with the same methodical approach I'd applied to everything else in my life. "What do we want to accomplish in the next 5 years?" I asked, pulling out a notebook to write down our goals. "Financial independence," Robert said immediately. "I want us to be in a position where we never have to worry about money the way our parents did." "Our own accounting practice," I added. "Something we can build together and eventually pass on to our children." "Children," Robert said softly. "I want to raise children who understand the value of hard work but never have to experience the kind of uncertainty we both grew up with." "How many children?" I asked. "2," Robert said without hesitation, "close enough in age to be companions for each other but far enough apart that we can give each one the individual attention they deserve." I wrote it all down in my careful handwriting. Our 5-year plan, our 10-year plan, our dreams for the family we wanted to create. It was the blueprint for the life that Marcus and Rebecca would eventually take for granted. The life they would dismiss as simple and unremarkable. But that night, sitting in our small kitchen with my new husband, planning the future we would build together, I felt nothing but hope and determination. I was Eleanor Blackwood now, a married woman with goals, plans, and a partner who respected my intelligence and ambition. I'd come so far from the little girl sharing a bed with two sisters in a cramped apartment above a hardware store. I'd kept every promise I'd made to my mother about creating choices through education and hard work. What I didn't know was that 37 years later, the children I would raise with such love and sacrifice would try to take away the very independence I'd worked so hard to achieve. They would threaten to declare me incompetent for suggesting I had financial resources they didn't know about. They would laugh at the idea that their mother might have been building something significant, while they assumed she was just a helpless widow. But they would discover, as everyone who'd ever underestimated me had learned, that Eleanor Blackwood was not a woman who stayed down when life knocked her over. I was a fighter. I'd always been a fighter. And I wasn't done fighting yet. Ever. The woman who'd lifted herself out of poverty through determination and education was still inside me. She'd just been hiding behind the role of dutiful wife and mother for so long that my own children had forgotten she existed. They were about to remember. In 1981, Marcus was born. 2 years later, Rebecca joined our family. Robert's accounting practice was thriving. We'd bought a modest house in a good neighborhood. Everything was proceeding exactly according to our carefully made plans. But something began to change in our household dynamic after the children arrived. Something subtle but significant that would shape the next 30 years of our marriage. Robert started making assumptions about our roles that he'd never made before. Assumptions about who would handle what responsibilities. Assumptions about whose career was more important. Assumptions about whose opinions mattered most in financial decisions. It started small. Robert would make comments about how lucky I was to be able to stay home with the children part-time. As if working reduced hours was a privilege rather than a sacrifice I was making for our family. Eleanor has it easy now, he'd joke to friends. She gets to play with babies all day while I handle the serious work of supporting the family. Play with babies. Handle the serious work. As if raising children and managing a household wasn't serious work that required intelligence, organization, and problem-solving skills. When I tried to discuss investment decisions or business strategies, Robert would pat my hand condescendingly. "Don't worry about that stuff, honey," he'd say. "I've got it handled. You focus on the kids." Don't worry about that stuff. Focus on the kids. As if I'd lost my business education and financial knowledge the moment I became a mother. Gradually, Robert began excluding me from financial discussions entirely. He'd make investment decisions without consulting me. He'd change our insurance policies without asking my opinion. He'd plan our budget without considering my input. "It's easier if one person handles all the money stuff," he'd explain when I questioned this arrangement. "Too many cooks spoil the broth." One person. As if marriage was a hierarchy rather than a partnership. As if my opinions and expertise had become irrelevant because I'd chosen to prioritize our children during their early years. This shift troubled me deeply, but I didn't know how to address it without seeming ungrateful or confrontational. Robert was working hard to support our family. He was a good father and husband in many ways. Maybe it was selfish to insist on being involved in every financial decision. But I also remembered Dr. Sullivan's warnings about women who allowed themselves to become financially dependent. Who trusted their husbands to handle everything without maintaining their own knowledge and involvement. "Never let anyone else control your access to money," she'd told our class. "Even if you trust them completely. Even if you love them. Circumstances change. People change. Always maintain your own financial literacy and independence." That's when I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I decided to start building my own financial resources. Not to challenge Robert's authority or undermine our marriage, but to protect myself and our children if anything ever happened to him. I started with my part-time library job. The salary wasn't much, but Robert had never paid attention to exactly how much I earned. He assumed it was pocket money for small household expenses. Instead of spending that money on household items, I started saving every penny. $23 a week might not sound like much, but it added up over time. I also started a small craft business, just like I'd planned years earlier, making baby quilts, knitted items, and holiday decorations to sell at local fairs and markets. Robert thought it was a cute hobby, something to keep me busy during nap time and evenings when the children were sleeping. What Robert didn't realize was that my cute hobby was generating several $100s a month in profit. Money I was quietly saving in a separate account he didn't know about. Several hundred. I told myself I was just being prudent, building an emergency fund in case Robert got sick or lost his job, creating a small buffer that would help our family if we ever faced unexpected expenses. But deep down, I knew I was doing something more significant. I was maintaining my independence. I was ensuring that I would never be completely dependent on someone else's financial decisions, no matter how much I loved and trusted them. By 1987, when Marcus was 6 and Rebecca was 4, I had saved nearly $4,000 from my library job and craft sales. Not a fortune, but enough to feel like I had some security of my own. That's when Robert had his heart attack. The event that would reveal just how precarious our financial situation really was. And just how important it was that I'd been building my own resources, even though Robert had no idea they existed. The night I sat in the hospital waiting room, wondering if my husband would survive, I wasn't just worried about losing the man I loved. I was worried about how I would support our children if Robert died. That's when I realized I needed to get much more serious about building my own financial security. Not just as a safety net, but as a guarantee that I would never be helpless or dependent, no matter what life threw at me. The quiet, invisible strategy I'd been using was about to become much more aggressive. And much more secret. Because I'd learned something important during Robert's health crises. Being financially vulnerable wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. It put you at the mercy of other people's decisions and assumptions. I was never going to be vulnerable again, even if that meant building wealth that my own family didn't know existed. Robert's heart attack changed everything. Not just our family dynamics, but my entire approach to financial security. What had started as a small emergency fund became a serious wealth-building strategy that would span the next 30 years. The night I sat in that hospital waiting room, I made a promise to myself. I would never again be in a position where someone else's health or decisions could leave me and my children vulnerable. Robert recovered fully from his heart attack. But during his 3-week recovery period, I had to handle all our family finances for the first time in years. What I discovered shocked me. Despite Robert's good salary and careful public image, we were living much closer to the edge than I'd realized. Our savings account had less than $2,000. We were carrying credit card debt I didn't know existed. Robert had been using our equity line of credit to cover monthly shortfalls. "It's temporary," Robert assured me when I questioned our financial situation. "I had some unexpected business expenses. Everything will normalize once I'm back to work full-time." But I'd seen the numbers, I'd talked to our creditors. I'd reviewed 3 years of bank statements while organizing his paperwork. We weren't in crisis, but we weren't secure either. One major expense could put us in serious financial trouble. That's when I realized Robert had been protecting me from our financial reality. Not out of malice, but out of old-fashioned ideas about shielding wives from money worries. Shieldty. The problem was, I didn't want to be shielded. I wanted to be informed. I wanted to be involved. I wanted to help solve problems rather than just trust someone else to handle them. "Robert," I said carefully, "I think I should be more involved in our financial planning. I have a business degree, I understand these concepts. Maybe I can help." Robert's response was exactly what I'd feared. Condescending reassurance rather than genuine partnership. "Eleanor, you don't need to worry about this stuff," he said, patting my hand like I was a child asking about adult topics. "I know it seems complicated, but I've got everything under control." everything under control. When we had less than $2,000 in savings and were carrying debt I hadn't known existed. That conversation convinced me that I needed to accelerate my own financial planning. Not to compete with Robert, but to protect our family in ways he apparently wasn't able to do. I started studying investing with the same intensity I'd once applied to my college coursework. I checked out every book about personal finance from the library where I worked. I subscribed to financial magazines using my maiden name. I watched investment programs on television during my lunch breaks. What I learned was that most people, even educated people like Robert, treated investing like gambling. They bought stocks based on tips from friends. They panic sold during market downturns. They made emotional decisions with money that should have been strategic decisions. But I also learned that building wealth through investing wasn't mysterious or complicated. It required discipline, patience, and a long-term perspective. It required treating money like a tool rather than an emotional topic. Most importantly, I learned that starting early was more important than starting with large amounts. A small amount invested consistently over decades would grow into something substantial through the power of compound returns. I had time, I had knowledge. What I needed was a system for building wealth that Robert wouldn't notice or question. That's when I developed what I privately called my invisible investment strategy. Every dollar I earned from my library job went into a separate checking account at a different bank. I told Robert the first was saving money for household emergencies, which was partially true. Winter. But instead of keeping the money in a savings account, I was investing it in index funds and diversified mutual funds. Small amounts, but invested consistently every month. My craft business provided another income stream that Robert underestimated. He saw me making baby quilts and knitted scarves during evening television time. He assumed I was earning maybe $50 or $60 a month from craft fairs. In reality, I was generating $300 to $400 a month in profit. Money that went directly into my investment accounts without ever touching our household budget. I also started freelance bookkeeping for several small businesses in town. Work I could do from home during the children's nap times or after they went to bed. Robert knew I was helping a few local shop owners with their paperwork, but he assumed it was volunteer work, or nearly volunteer work. I was actually charging competitive rates for professional accounting services. Another $200 to $300 a month that Robert never saw or questioned. By 1990, 3 years after Robert's heart attack, I was investing nearly $800 a month in various accounts. Money from 3 different income sources that Robert either didn't know about or significantly underestimated. But more importantly, I was learning how to make that money grow. I studied successful investors like Warren Buffett and Peter Lynch. I learned about value investing, dollar cost averaging, and asset allocation. I researched companies before buying their stock. I diversified across different sectors and investment types. What I discovered was that I had a natural aptitude for investment analysis. I could read financial statements. I could evaluate business models. I could identify companies that were likely to grow over time. But I also learned to avoid the mistakes that destroyed most people's investment returns. I didn't try to time the market. I didn't chase hot tips or trendy stocks. I didn't panic during market downturns. The CUS. Instead, I invested like I was building something permanent. Something that would provide security for decades, not excitement for months. By 1992, when Marcus was 11 and Rebecca was 9, my secret investment accounts had grown to over $15,000. By 1995, I had accumulated nearly $30,000. Still not a fortune, but enough to know that my strategy was working, that I was building real wealth through patience and discipline. But I also realized I needed to be more strategic about hiding my activities from Robert. $15,000 was getting harder to explain as household emergency money. That's when I started using my maiden name for all my investment accounts. Eleanor Mitchell instead of Eleanor Blackwood. Different banks, different addresses, different tax identification strategies. I wasn't trying to hide money from my husband out of malice. I was protecting resources that might be crucial for our family's future. Resources that Robert might not approve of if he knew how substantial they were becoming. Because I'd learned something about Robert during his recovery period. He was more concerned with appearing financially successful than actually being financially secure. He wanted to maintain a certain lifestyle and public image, even if it meant carrying debt or living paycheck to paycheck. That attitude made me nervous. Very nervous. I wanted real security, not the appearance of security. I wanted assets that could protect our family during genuine emergencies, not just assets that made us look prosperous to neighbors and friends. So I kept building my invisible investment portfolio while Robert focused on maintaining our visible lifestyle. The 1990s were an incredible decade for investors who had the discipline to stay in the market and keep adding money regularly. My consistent investing strategy paid off in ways that exceeded my most optimistic projections. By 1998, my secret accounts had grown to over $60,000. By 2000, I had accumulated nearly $100,000 in various investments. $100,000. More money than Robert and I had ever accumulated in our joint accounts. Money he didn't know existed. But I still wasn't satisfied. $100,000 was substantial, but it wasn't enough to provide real independence. It wasn't enough to ensure that I could support myself and help our children if something happened to Robert. That's when I decided to get more aggressive about building my wealth. Emaku Arbentus Mans. I expanded my craft business beyond local fairs to include online sales. This was the early days of internet commerce, but I recognized the potential immediately. I could reach customers anywhere in the country. I could sell my handmade items for higher prices to people who appreciated quality craftsmanship. Within 2 years, my online craft sales were generating over $1,000 a month in profit. Money that went directly into my investment accounts. I also started offering financial consulting services to small business owners in our area. Unofficial consulting, paid in cash, for people who needed help with basic bookkeeping and financial planning, but couldn't afford a major accounting firm. This work was particularly satisfying because it used my education and natural abilities in ways that my part-time library job never did. I was helping people solve real problems. I was providing valuable services that improved their businesses and their lives. And I was earning substantial fees that Robert never knew about. By 2005, I was generating nearly $2,000 a month from various income sources that Robert either didn't know about or significantly underestimated. Money that was being invested systematically in a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. But 2005 was also the year that changed our family dynamic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus graduated from college that spring. Rebecca was finishing her sophomore year. Both children were becoming independent adults with their own goals and priorities. Robert began talking about retirement planning for the first time in our marriage. Not because he was ready to retire, but because he was finally realizing that he hadn't built the financial security he'd always assumed would somehow appear. "Eleanor," he said one evening as we reviewed our joint financial statements, "I'm worried we're not going to have enough money for retirement." We weren't. Based on Robert's 401k and our joint savings, we were looking at a retirement income that would be significantly lower than our current standard of living. "What do you think we should do?" I asked carefully. "I need to work longer than I planned," Robert said. "Maybe until I'm 70. And we need to start saving more aggressively." Start saving more aggressively? When I'd been saving and investing aggressively for 15 years. That's when I made a decision that would shape the rest of our marriage. I decided not to tell Robert about my investment accounts. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because I realized that Robert would want to use my money to fund his retirement plans. Plans that didn't necessarily align with my own goals and priorities. I'd built that money through my own intelligence, discipline, and hard work. I'd sacrificed spending on things I wanted so I could invest for our future. I'd educated myself about financial markets while Robert assumed his 401k contributions were sufficient. Why should I hand over control of resources I'd built to someone who'd excluded me from financial decisions for decades? Instead, I decided to continue building my wealth quietly while letting Robert believe we were in the financial situation he'd created through his own planning. If he wanted more retirement security, he could work longer or save more from his own income. My money would remain my safety net, available if our family faced a genuine crisis, but not available to subsidize poor planning or inflated lifestyle expectations. That decision created a new dynamic in our household. Robert became increasingly worried about money as he approached his 60s. He started talking about downsizing our house, reducing our expenses, and living more frugally. Meanwhile, I was sitting on investment accounts worth over $200,000 that were growing by thousands of dollars every month. The irony was almost overwhelming. Robert, who'd always handled our serious financial decisions, was worried about our future security, while I, who'd been dismissed as financially naive, had built substantial wealth that could solve all his concerns. But I kept my secret, week after week, month after month, year after year. Because I'd learned something important about financial independence. It's not just about having money. It's about having control over your own resources. It's about not being dependent on other people's financial wisdom or generosity. Robert had taught me that lesson through 15 years of excluding me from financial decisions. He'd shown me what it felt like to be considered financially irrelevant in my own marriage. And my own marriage. Now I was financially independent, even though he didn't know it. And I intended to stay that way. By 2010, when Robert was diagnosed with cancer, my investment accounts had grown to over $400,000. More money than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Money that could have paid for any treatment he needed, any care he required, any comfort he wanted during his illness. But Robert never knew it existed. He faced his cancer diagnosis believing we had limited financial resources. He worried about medical bills and lost income while I sat beside his hospital bed, knowing I could solve every financial concern he had. I didn't tell him about the money during his illness. Not because I was cruel, but because I understood that Robert would have wanted to control how that money was used. He would have made decisions about my resources without consulting me, just like he'd made decisions about our family finances for 25 years. The money I'd built was my insurance policy, my guarantee that I wouldn't be helpless if he died. My proof that I was more financially capable than anyone in my family had ever imagined. When Robert died in 2016, he left me with the house, about $20,000 in joint savings, and his small life insurance policy. Exactly what Marcus and Rebecca saw when they helped settle his estate. What they didn't see was that I'd accumulated over $600,000 in investment accounts under my maiden name. Money their father had never known about. Money they had no reason to suspect existed. But I still wasn't done building. After Robert's funeral, after our children returned to their own lives, I threw myself into wealth building with an intensity that surprised even me. For the first time in my adult life, I could make financial decisions without considering anyone else's opinions or priorities. I had advantages I'd never had before. No husband to question my activities. No children at home to notice my work schedule. Complete freedom to pursue income opportunities and investment strategies without explanation or justification. I expanded my online craft business into a full-scale operation. I raised my prices significantly because I'd learned that people were willing to pay premium amounts for genuinely handmade, high-quality items. I started teaching financial literacy classes at the community college. Part-time work that paid well and used my expertise in ways that were personally satisfying. I also began more aggressive investing. Not reckless investing, but more concentrated positions in companies I'd researched thoroughly. Higher risk, higher reward strategies that were appropriate for someone with substantial assets and decades of investment experience. The results exceeded my most optimistic projections. By 2018, 2 years after Robert's death, my investment accounts had grown to over $1 million. $1 million. An amount that seemed impossible when I'd started with $200 30 years earlier. But I still wasn't satisfied. $1 million was substantial, but I wanted more. Not for luxury or status, but for absolute security. For the kind of financial independence that would allow me to live exactly as I chose without depending on anyone else's support or approval. Building. I kept building. More aggressively, more strategically, more successfully than ever before. By 2020, I had accumulated over $1.8 million. By 2022, over $2.3 million. And by March 2024, when Marcus laughed at my retirement plans, I had accumulated $2.8 million in various investment accounts. More money than my children would earn in their entire careers. More money than Robert and I had ever dreamed of accumulating together. More money than anyone in my family could imagine a part-time library worker possessing. But they'd never asked the right questions. They'd never wondered what I'd been doing with my time for 8 years since Robert died. They'd never considered that a woman who'd managed a household budget for 30 years might also be capable of managing substantial investments. They'd made assumptions about my capabilities, my intelligence, and my financial resources. Assumptions that were about to cost them more than they could possibly imagine. Because the night Marcus laughed at my retirement plans, I decided it was time to stop hiding my capabilities. It was time to show my children exactly what their mother had accomplished while they assumed she was just a helpless widow. It was time to disappear with every penny I'd built over 37 years of disciplined investing. And it was time to let Marcus and Rebecca explain to their friends how they'd lost track of a 70-year-old woman who supposedly had no money and no options. They thought they knew their mother. They thought they understood my situation. They thought they could plan my future without consulting me. Mo havelat fodzo insati kama sabri, no havelat hama sabri tama sabras. They were wrong about everything. The woman they'd dismissed as financially naive had built more wealth than they'd ever imagined possible. The woman they'd threatened with guardianship had more resources than they had ever accumulated. The woman they'd laughed at was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Building a family should have been the happiest time of our lives. Robert and I had everything we dreamed about: financial stability, a comfortable home, and 2 healthy children who filled our days with joy and purpose. But somewhere between Marcus's birth in 1981 and Rebecca's arrival in 1983, something fundamental shifted in our marriage. Something that would shape the next 30 years of our relationship and ultimately influence how my children viewed money, work, and their mother's capabilities. The changes started small. So small that I didn't recognize them as warning signs at the time. When Marcus was born, Robert and I had agreed that I would reduce my work hours to spend more time at home. Not because we believed mothers should stay home, but because we wanted our children to have at least one parent available during their early years. "We can afford for you to work part-time," Robert said when we discussed childcare options. "Why pay someone else to raise our son when you could be home with him?" It seemed like a reasonable decision. I loved spending time with Marcus. I enjoyed the flexibility of working fewer hours. And Robert's accounting practice was generating enough income to support our reduced household earnings. But Robert's attitude toward my part-time work began to change almost immediately. Instead of recognizing that I was making a career sacrifice for our family's benefit, he started treating my reduced work schedule like a privilege I should be grateful for. "Eleanor's got the easy job now," he'd joke to friends when they asked about our new family routine. "She gets to stay home and play with the baby while I handle the real work of supporting the family." Play with the baby. Handle the real work. As if caring for an infant was recreational activity rather than demanding, important work that required constant attention and decision-making. When I tried to discuss financial decisions or business strategies, Robert's responses became increasingly dismissive. "Don't worry your pretty head about that," he'd say with a patronizing smile. "You focus on taking care of Marcus. I'll handle the money stuff." Don't worry your pretty head. Focus on taking care of Marcus. As if becoming a mother had somehow erased my business education and financial knowledge. Follows Amel. The changes accelerated after Rebecca was born. Robert began making unilateral decisions about our finances without consulting me at all. He'd refinance our mortgage without discussing terms with me. He'd make investment choices without asking my opinion. He'd plan our budget without considering my input. "It's more efficient if one person handles all the financial decisions," he'd explain when I questioned this arrangement. "Too many opinions just complicate things." One person. Efficient. As if marriage was a business where hierarchy was more important than partnership. But what troubled me most wasn't just Robert's exclusion of me from financial decisions. It was how our children were learning to view money and work roles from watching our daily interactions. Marcus and Rebecca saw their father leaving for work every morning in a suit and tie. They saw him coming home with briefcases full of important papers. They heard him taking business calls and discussing significant financial decisions. Meanwhile, they saw their mother doing laundry, preparing meals, and managing household tasks. Work that was essential but invisible. work that didn't seem to require education or generate income. By the time Marcus was 5 and Rebecca was 3, both children had internalized the idea that fathers worked and mothers took care of houses, that men made money and women spent it, that financial decisions were too complicated for wives to understand. "Oh, so? Why doesn't mommy go to work like other mommies?" Marcus asked one afternoon as we walked past the library where I still worked part-time. "Mommy does work," I explained. "I work at the library 3 days a week." "But that's not real work," Marcus said with the casual certainty of a 5-year-old. "Real work is what Daddy does. Making money and important decisions. Real work. Important decisions." My 5-year-old son had already learned to dismiss his mother's contributions as less significant than his father's. I tried to correct these misconceptions, but Robert's daily behavior reinforced them more powerfully than my occasional explanations could counteract. When friends visited our home, Robert would hold court about business strategies and investment opportunities, while I served refreshments and managed the children. When we attended social events, Robert networked with other business owners while I chatted with wives about household topics. The division of roles seemed natural and comfortable to Robert, but it felt increasingly restrictive and diminishing to me. I'd worked hard to earn my business degree. I'd proven my competence in professional environments. I'd contributed meaningfully to our financial planning before the children were born, but motherhood had somehow relegated me to a supporting role in my own life. A role that was essential but undervalued. A role that required intelligence and skill but received little recognition or respect. That's when I started thinking more seriously about maintaining my own financial resources, not to compete with Robert or undermine our marriage, but to ensure that I retained some measure of independence and recognition for my own capabilities. My part-time library job provided the perfect foundation for this strategy. Robert knew I worked 3 days a week, but he'd never paid close attention to exactly how much I earned or what I did with my salary. He assumed my library income was pin money for small household expenses and personal luxuries, money that wasn't significant enough to factor into our serious financial planning. That assumption gave me the freedom to treat my library salary as the foundation for my own investment strategy. $23 a week wasn't much, but it was mine to manage however I chose. I also started my craft business during this period, initially as a way to earn extra money while staying home with the children. Making baby quilts during nap time, knitting scarves while watching television in the evenings, creating holiday decorations that I could sell at local fairs and markets. Robert was supportive of my craft business in the same condescending way he'd become supportive of my library work. He saw it as a harmless hobby that kept me busy and occasionally generated pocket money. "Eleanor's got her little craft business," he'd tell people with the same tone he might use to describe a child's lemonade stand. "It's cute. Gives her something to do while the kids are napping. Little craft business, something to do." As if I were engaging in recreational activities rather than building a profitable enterprise that required business planning, marketing skills, and financial management. But Robert's dismissive attitude worked to my advantage. Because he didn't take my craft business seriously, he never paid attention to how much money it was actually generating, which was considerably more than he imagined. By 1985, my craft business was producing nearly $200 a month in profit. Combined with my library salary, I was earning almost $400 a month that Robert either didn't know about or significantly underestimated. $400 a month might not sound like much, but it represented real money that I could save and invest without impacting our household budget or attracting Robert's attention. More importantly, it represented proof that I was still capable of generating income and making financial decisions, despite Robert's increasing tendency to treat me like a dependent rather than a partner. I started educating myself about investing with the same determination I'd once applied to my college coursework. I checked out books about personal finance from the library where I worked. I subscribed to investment magazines using my maiden name. I studied successful investors and learned about different investment strategies. L'Mato. What I discovered was that building wealth through investing wasn't complicated or mysterious. It required discipline, patience, and basic knowledge about how markets worked. It required treating money as a tool, rather than an emotional topic. Most importantly, it required starting early and investing consistently, regardless of the amounts involved. Woebie, I had time, I had some money. I had the knowledge I was acquiring through dedicated study. What I needed was a system for investing that Robert wouldn't notice or question. That's when I opened my first investment account, under my maiden name at a bank across town, Eleanor Mitchell instead of Eleanor Blackwood. A different address, a different identity for financial purposes. OSA, I started with $300 from my craft business profits. Not much, but enough to begin building something of my own. Ice-free month. I added whatever money I could spare from my library salary and craft sales. $20 here, $50 there. Small amounts that accumulated into something more significant over time. But I was also learning something else during this period. Something that would become crucial to my long-term strategy. Kui mola. I was learning how to be financially invisible. Kui molases. Nobody paid attention to part-time library workers or craft vendors at local fairs. Nobody assumed that mothers who spent their days managing households were also studying investment strategies. Nobody imagined that women who made baby quilts might also be building stock portfolios. My demographics provided perfect camouflage for wealth-building activities. People saw exactly what they expected to see: a devoted mother and wife who worked part-time jobs to contribute modestly to her family's income. They didn't see someone who was systematically building financial independence through disciplined saving and strategic investing. This invisibility became a tremendous advantage. I could research investments without anyone questioning my activities. I could make financial decisions without anyone offering unwanted advice. I could build wealth quietly while everyone assumed I was just fulfilling traditional domestic roles. By 1987, when Marcus was 6 and Rebecca was 4, my secret investment account had grown to nearly $3,000. Still not a fortune, but enough to prove that my strategy was working. Niugaday. That's also when Robert had his heart attack. The event that would reveal just how important my invisible wealth-building strategy really was. During Robert's 3-week recovery period, I had to handle our family finances for the first time in years. What I discovered was sobering. Despite Robert's confident management of our money, we had less than $2,000 in emergency savings. We were carrying credit card debt I didn't know existed. Robert had been using our home equity line to cover monthly budget shortfalls. We weren't in immediate financial crisis, but we were much more vulnerable than I'd realized. One major expense could put us in serious trouble. "Don't worry about the money situation," Robert assured me when I questioned our financial position. "I've got everything under control. This is just a temporary cash flow issue." But I'd seen the bank statements. I'd talked to our creditors. I'd reviewed our debts and compared them to our income. By was. We didn't have everything under control. We had been living paycheck to paycheck while maintaining the appearance of financial stability. That realization convinced me that I needed to accelerate my own financial planning. Not to challenge Robert's authority, but to protect our family in ways he apparently wasn't able to do. I started investing more aggressively. Instead of $20 or $50 a month, I began putting $200 or $300 monthly into my secret accounts. Money from expanded craft sales, freelance bookkeeping work, and careful management of household expenses that created small savings Robert never noticed. I also started educating myself more seriously about advanced investment strategies. I learned about asset allocation, diversification, and long-term wealth-building techniques that went far beyond basic savings accounts. By 1990, my secret investment accounts had grown to over $8,000. By 1992, I had accumulated nearly $15,000. $15,000. More money than Robert and I had ever accumulated in our joint savings accounts. Money he didn't know existed. But I wasn't building this wealth for selfish reasons. I was building it as insurance for our family's future. As protection against the kind of financial vulnerability I'd discovered during Robert's illness. If Robert became disabled or lost his job, my secret resources could bridge the gap until we found alternative solutions. If our children needed money for college or medical emergencies, I could provide it without putting our family into debt. If something happened to Robert, I wouldn't be left financially helpless the way so many widows were when their husbands died without adequate life insurance or retirement savings. I was building security that our family needed, even though Robert didn't know we needed it. But I was also proving something to myself. I was proving that I hadn't lost my financial capabilities when I became a mother. I was proving that I could make smart investment decisions and build substantial wealth through disciplined planning. I was proving that Eleanor Blackwood was still the same intelligent, capable woman who'd earned a business degree and worked successfully before her children were born. Robert's condescending attitude toward my abilities had made me doubt myself for several years. His dismissal of my opinions and exclusion from financial decisions had made me feel like I was less capable than I'd been before marriage and motherhood. But my secret investment success was restoring my confidence. I was good at this. I was very good at making money grow through smart decisions and patient planning. By 1995, when Marcus was 14 and Rebecca was 12, my hidden investment accounts contained over $25,000. Money that had grown through consistent contributions and smart investment choices. Money that represented financial independence Robert couldn't take away from me through condescending attitudes or unilateral decisions. Money that proved I was still the financially capable woman I'd always been, regardless of how my family had learned to perceive me. But $25,000 was just the beginning. I was thinking in terms of decades now, not years. I was building wealth that would provide real security for the rest of my life. Wealth that would allow me to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. Keep. Wealth that would ensure I never had to depend on anyone else's financial decisions or generosity, no matter how much I loved them. Because I'd learned something important during those early years of secret investing. Financial independence wasn't just about having money. It was about having control over your own life. It was about being able to make decisions based on your own values and priorities, rather than someone else's assumptions about what you needed or deserved. Robert had taught me that lesson through years of excluding me from financial planning. He'd shown me what it felt like to be considered financially irrelevant in my own marriage. I was never going to feel that way again. Fardia nusa becantable, even if it meant building wealth that my own family didn't know existed. Kolop. Even if it meant maintaining financial secrets that would last for decades. Even if it meant becoming financially independent while pretending to be financially dependent. Because the alternative, being truly dependent on other people's financial wisdom and generosity, was something I would never accept again. I was Eleanor Blackwood. I was intelligent, capable, and determined. I was building something that would protect me and my family for the rest of our lives. People was menmashes, and I was just getting started. People. The late 1990s and early 2000s marked the golden years of our family life. Robert's accounting practice was thriving. Marcus and Rebecca were excelling in school and developing into confident, capable young adults. Our household had achieved the financial stability and comfortable lifestyle we dreamed about when we were newlyweds. But this period also revealed something troubling about how my children viewed money, work, and their mother's role in creating the prosperity they took for granted. By 1998, my secret investment accounts had grown to over $60,000. But to Marcus and Rebecca, I was still just mom who worked part-time at the library and made crafts during her spare time. They had no idea their mother had become a sophisticated investor managing a substantial portfolio. They saw Robert leaving for work in expensive suits, driving newer cars, and handling what appeared to be all the important financial decisions in our household. Meanwhile, they saw me doing laundry, preparing meals, and engaging in what they perceived as minor activities that generated pocket money. This perception became increasingly problematic as Marcus and Rebecca entered their teenage years and started forming their own attitudes about money and work. Mom, why don't you have a real job like Dad? Rebecca asked one afternoon when she was 13. She'd been comparing our family to her friends' families, many of whom had mothers working full-time in professional careers. I do have a real job, I replied. I work at the library and I have my craft business. But those aren't important jobs, Rebecca said with the casual cruelty of adolescence. Dad makes the real money. You just do little things for spending money. Little things for spending money. My 13-year-old daughter had already learned to dismiss her mother's work as insignificant compared to her father's career. Marcus had developed similar attitudes, though he expressed them differently. "Dad's really smart about money," he told me one evening when he was 15. "He knows how to invest and plan for the future. That's why we can afford nice things. Dad's really smart about money." As if I had no knowledge or involvement in our family's financial success. What made these comments particularly painful was that they reflected Robert's attitude more than any actual understanding of how our household functioned. My children had learned to view their father as the sole source of our family's prosperity, because that's how Robert presented himself. When we bought a larger house in 1999, Robert made the announcement to the children as if he'd accomplished this achievement independently. "I've been working hard and saving money so we could move to a better neighborhood," he told Marcus and Rebecca. This is what happens when you apply yourself and make smart financial decisions. Working hard and saving money. Smart financial decisions. No mention of my contributions to our household income or my involvement in evaluating the real estate purchase. When we took family vacations, Robert would emphasize how his successful business made these trips possible. When we bought new cars or furniture, Robert would explain how his careful financial planning allowed us to afford these luxuries. Never any acknowledgement that I'd been contributing to our financial success through my own work and careful household management. Never any recognition that our comfortable lifestyle was the result of two people working together rather than one person providing for everyone else. But I was also contributing to our family's prosperity in ways that Robert and the children couldn't see. My secret investment accounts were growing rapidly during this period, providing a financial safety net that our family didn't know existed. By 2000, I had accumulated nearly $90,000 in various investment accounts. By 2003, my hidden wealth had grown to over $120,000. This money wasn't just sitting in savings accounts. I was actively managing a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. I was researching companies, analyzing market trends, and making sophisticated investment decisions that required significant financial knowledge and skill. But to my family, I was still just mom, who worked part-time and made craft items for extra spending money. The disconnect between my actual financial capabilities and my family's perception of my abilities became even more pronounced when Marcus and Rebecca started preparing for college. "Mom, how are we going to pay for college?" Marcus asked during his junior year of high school. "College is really expensive, and I don't think we have enough money saved." We didn't have enough money saved in our joint accounts. Robert's college savings plan was woefully inadequate for the quality of education Marcus wanted to pursue. "Your father and I will figure it out," I assured Marcus. "Don't worry about the financial aspects. Focus on getting good grades and choosing schools that are right for you." What I didn't tell Marcus was that I had more than enough money in my secret accounts to pay for his entire college education without affecting our family's standard of living, and Rebecca's college costs as well. When Robert began stressing about college expenses and talking about taking out substantial loans, I faced a difficult decision. I could reveal my hidden resources and solve our family's financial concerns immediately. Or I could continue maintaining my secret while Robert worried about problems I could easily solve. I chose a middle path. I started contributing more money to our household finances, explaining it as increased income from my craft business and library work. "Business has been really good lately," I told Robert when I handed him an extra $500 for Marcus's college fund. "I've been selling more items online, and the library gave me some additional hours." Robert accepted this explanation without question. He'd never paid close attention to exactly how much money my little businesses were generating, so he had no reason to be suspicious of increased income. Over Marcus's senior year, I contributed nearly $8,000 to his college expenses, while maintaining the fiction that this money came from expanded craft sales and part-time work. Robert was grateful for my contributions, but he still treated them as supplementary to his primary responsibility for funding our children's education. "I really appreciate how hard you're working to help with college costs," he told me. "But don't feel like you have to carry this burden. I'm the main provider for this family." The main provider. Even when I was contributing substantial amounts to major family expenses, Robert saw himself as primarily responsible for our financial welfare. This attitude became even more problematic when Rebecca started high school and began making assumptions about her future that reflected our family's distorted financial dynamics. "I don't need to worry about money," Rebecca announced when her guidance counselor discussed financial aid applications. Dad makes enough money to pay for whatever college I want to attend. Dad makes enough money. No recognition that college expenses might require sacrifice or careful planning from multiple family members. Rebecca, I said carefully, college is expensive for any family. Even families with good incomes need to plan carefully and make smart choices. But we're rich, Rebecca said with the confidence of someone who'd never seen a detailed family budget. Dad's business is really successful. We can afford anything we want. We're rich. We can afford anything we want. My daughter had developed completely unrealistic expectations about money because she'd never been taught to understand the relationship between income, expenses, and financial planning. This became a pattern with both children as they progressed through high school and college. They made expensive requests without considering the financial impact. They chose costly activities and purchases without understanding how these decisions affected our family budget. Because from their perspective, money was something Dad provided and Mom occasionally supplemented through her minor activities. They'd never learned to think strategically about financial resources or to appreciate the work required to generate substantial income. When Marcus graduated from college in 2003 and needed money to move to his first apartment, he simply assumed we'd provide whatever he required. I need about $3,000 for deposits, furniture, and moving expenses, he told us casually, as if requesting lunch money. $3,000 was a significant amount for most families, but Marcus had no concept of how much money $3,000 represented in terms of work hours or budget impact. That's a lot of money, Marcus, I said. Maybe we should help you develop a plan for managing these expenses yourself. Mom, it's not that much money, Marcus replied with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never earned $3,000 himself. Dad can afford it. Dad can afford it. No consideration of whether this expense was reasonable or whether Marcus should take responsibility for his own moving costs. Robert ultimately provided the money, just as he'd provided money for countless other requests from our children over the years. Expensive sports equipment, costly school trips, designer clothes, electronic devices. Whatever Marcus and Rebecca wanted, Robert found ways to afford. But these generous expenditures were creating problematic attitudes in our children. They were learning that money was always available when they needed it. They were developing expectations of financial support that might not be sustainable as they became adults. More troubling, they were learning to take their parents' financial sacrifices for granted. They never asked how we could afford their requests. They never offered to contribute to family expenses through part-time jobs or reduced spending in other areas. They simply expected their standard of living to continue rising without understanding the work required to support that lifestyle. When Rebecca graduated from high school in 2005 and wanted to attend an expensive private university, she was shocked that we even discussed the financial implications. All my friends are going to schools that cost $40,000 a year, she said when Robert mentioned the price difference between her preferred school and less expensive alternatives. Money shouldn't be the deciding factor in my education. Money shouldn't be the deciding factor. As if financial resources were unlimited and family budgets didn't require difficult choices and trade-offs. Rebecca, I tried to explain, $40,000 a year is a significant expense for any family. We need to consider whether that cost is justified compared to other excellent schools that cost less. But you and Dad always say education is the most important investment, Rebecca argued. If it's really that important, then you should be willing to pay whatever it costs. This logic was both entitled and naive, but it reflected the attitudes our children had developed after years of having their financial requests granted without serious consideration of household budget constraints. Robert ultimately agreed to pay for Rebecca's expensive private university, just as he'd agreed to most of their other costly requests over the years. But the financial stress was beginning to show. I don't know how we're going to maintain this level of spending, Robert confided to me one evening as we reviewed college bills and other family expenses. Between the mortgage, both kids' college costs, and our regular living expenses, we're not saving anything for retirement. We weren't saving anything for retirement in our joint accounts. But I was continuing to build my secret investment portfolio, which had grown to over $200,000 by 2005. $200,000 that could solve all of Robert's financial concerns if I chose to reveal it, but I didn't choose to reveal it because I'd learned something important about family financial dynamics during this period. Generosity without boundaries creates entitlement rather than gratitude. Children who never experience financial constraints don't learn to value money or understand the work required to earn it. Robert's willingness to provide whatever our children requested was creating adults who expected financial support without offering appreciation or responsibility in return. I could have solved this problem by contributing my hidden resources to our family finances, but that would have enabled the same problematic patterns on a larger scale. Instead, I decided to let Robert experience the natural consequences of his generous parenting approach, while I continued building wealth that would protect me if our family's financial situation became unsustainable. By 2008, when Marcus was 27 and Rebecca was 25, both children had graduated from college and were beginning their adult careers. But they were also continuing to request financial support for various needs and wants. Marcus needed money for a car down payment. Rebecca needed money for her wedding. Both of them needed money for apartment deposits, furniture, and other expenses associated with independent living. When does this end? Robert asked me privately after writing another substantial check for one of our children's requests. They're both adults with jobs. When do they start supporting themselves? When do they start supporting themselves? When do they learn that financial independence requires work and sacrifice rather than parental generosity? These were questions Robert should have asked 15 years earlier, when our children were developing their basic attitudes about money and work. But he'd been so focused on being a generous provider that he'd never taught them to be financially responsible adults. Now Marcus and Rebecca expected continued financial support because they'd never learned to manage without it. They'd never developed the skills or mindset necessary for true financial independence. And Robert was finally beginning to understand that his generosity had created problems rather than solving them. But it was too late to change patterns that had been established over decades. Our children were adults who expected financial support from parents who were approaching retirement age with inadequate savings. By 2010, when Robert was diagnosed with cancer, our joint savings accounts contained less than $15,000. Robert's retirement fund was woefully inadequate for the lifestyle he'd been maintaining. Our family was financially vulnerable, despite years of good income. Meanwhile, my secret investment accounts had grown to over $400,000. Money that could have provided security for our entire family if Robert had been willing to treat me as a financial partner rather than a dependent. But Robert faced his cancer diagnosis believing we had limited resources, never knowing that his wife had accumulated substantial wealth that could solve every financial concern he had. I didn't tell him about my hidden money during his illness, not because I was cruel, but because I understood that Robert would have wanted to control those resources just as he'd controlled our family finances for 30 years. The money I'd built was my insurance policy, my guarantee that I wouldn't be helpless when Robert died, my proof that I was more financially capable than anyone in my family had ever imagined. When Robert died in 2016, he left me with exactly what Marcus and Rebecca saw during the estate settlement: a modest house, small savings account, and limited life insurance. What they didn't see was that I'd spent 37 years building wealth that exceeded anything our family had ever imagined possible. Wealth that I'd accumulated while they assumed I was just a part-time library worker who made craft items for spending money. Wealth that would allow me to disappear completely when they pushed me too far. They thought they knew their mother's financial situation. They thought they understood my capabilities and limitations. They were wrong about everything. The woman they'd learned to dismiss as financially irrelevant had become more financially powerful than they would ever be. And they were about to discover exactly how wrong their assumptions had been. The warning signs began appearing long before that devastating dinner at Marcus's house. Subtle changes in my children's behavior that revealed how they really viewed their mother and her place in their lives. Changes that I initially dismissed as normal adult independence but gradually recognized as something much more troubling. Robert's death in 2016 marked a turning point in my relationships with Marcus and Rebecca. Not because we were grieving together, but because they suddenly saw me as a responsibility they hadn't anticipated having to manage. During Robert's final months, when he was too sick to handle our family's financial affairs, I had seamlessly taken over all the tasks he'd managed for decades: paying bills, managing investments, dealing with insurance companies, organizing medical care, handling legal documents. I did all of this efficiently and competently, never missing a payment or making a financial mistake. But Marcus and Rebecca didn't seem to notice or appreciate my capabilities during this difficult period. Instead, they treated my management of complex affairs as if I were a child playing with adult responsibilities. They offered constant advice about tasks I was already handling successfully. They questioned decisions I'd made based on decades of financial knowledge they didn't know I possessed. "Mom, are you sure you know how to handle Dad's business accounts?" Marcus asked one afternoon as I organized Robert's client files for transfer to another accountant. "I've been helping your father with bookkeeping for years," I replied. "I understand how his business operated." "But this is complicated financial stuff," Marcus insisted. "Maybe Rebecca and I should help you figure it out." Complicated financial stuff. As if I hadn't been managing complex investment portfolios for 28 years, while they assumed I was incapable of understanding basic money concepts. Rebecca had similar concerns about my ability to handle practical matters after Robert's death. "Mom, you've never lived alone before," she said as we planned Robert's funeral arrangements. "You might want to consider moving closer to one of us so we can help you with things." Never lived alone before. Help me with things. As if I were an elderly child who couldn't manage basic life tasks without supervision. But what troubled me most wasn't their lack of confidence in my abilities. It was their complete lack of curiosity about how I was managing so competently. They never asked where I'd learned to handle financial and legal matters. They never wondered how I could transition so smoothly from dependent wife to capable widow. They simply assumed that any competence I displayed was temporary or superficial, that eventually I would need their guidance and support to navigate the complicated world of independent living. The months following Robert's funeral revealed even more concerning attitudes about my future and their role in managing it. "We need to talk about your long-term plans," Marcus announced during one of his visits to my house. "You can't keep living in this big house by yourself forever. Can't keep living in this big house forever." As if my housing decisions were his to make rather than mine. "Wafie. I'm managing fine," I said. "The house isn't too big, and I enjoy living here." "But Mom, you're 68 years old," Rebecca chimed in. "What happens when you get older and can't take care of yourself?" When you get older and can't take care of yourself. They were already planning for my decline into helplessness, despite no evidence that such decline was imminent or inevitable. "I'll deal with that if and when it becomes necessary," I replied. "Right now, I'm healthy and independent." "You say that now," Marcus said in the patronizing tone he'd learned from his father. "But these things sneak up on people. It's better to plan ahead." Plan ahead. Make decisions about my future based on their assumptions about my limitations rather than my actual capabilities. Over the next 2 years, these conversations became increasingly frequent and condescending. Marcus and Rebecca had appointed themselves as my future caregivers and decision-makers, despite my consistent demonstration of competence and independence. They would visit my house and point out maintenance issues I should address. They would question my driving abilities and suggest I consider giving up my car. They would recommend doctors, financial advisors, and service providers as if I were incapable of making these decisions myself. "Mom, you really should let us help you find a good financial advisor," Rebecca suggested during one visit. "Managing money is complicated, especially for someone who's never done it before. My daughter had no idea that I'd been managing a complex investment portfolio worth over $600,000 for nearly 3 decades. "I'm handling my finances just fine," I assured her. "But Dad always took care of the money stuff," Rebecca persisted. "You probably don't understand all the details." "Don't understand all the details. If only she knew that I understood financial details far better than her father ever had. But what bothered me most about these interactions wasn't just their condescending assumptions. It was their complete lack of interest in learning who I really was or what I was actually capable of. They had formed an image of me as a simple, dependent woman who needed their guidance and protection. And they were determined to maintain that image regardless of any evidence to the contrary. When I mentioned taking a financial planning class at the community college, Marcus laughed dismissively. "Mom, those classes are designed for people who are just starting to learn about money," he said. You don't need to complicate your situation with investment strategies you won't understand. Won't understand. Despite the fact that I'd been successfully implementing sophisticated investment strategies for longer than he'd been employed. When I talked about possibly traveling or pursuing new hobbies, Rebecca immediately focused on the risks and limitations. Be careful about spending too much money on travel, she warned. You need to make your savings last for the rest of your life. Make your savings last. She assumed I was living on limited resources that required careful rationing, never imagining that I had accumulated more wealth than she and her husband possessed. These attitudes became even more problematic when my children started making assumptions about their eventual inheritance and their role in my future care. When you're ready to sell the house, Rebecca and I can help you find a nice apartment or senior community, Marcus offered during one visit. We'll make sure you get a fair price and find someplace that's appropriate for your needs. But what troubled me most wasn't their lack of confidence in my abilities. It was their complete lack of curiosity about how I was managing so competently. They never asked where I'd learned to handle financial and legal matters. They never wondered how I could transition so smoothly from dependent wife to capable widow. They simply assumed that any competence I displayed was temporary or superficial, that eventually I would need their guidance and support to navigate the complicated world of independent living. The months following Robert's funeral revealed even more concerning attitudes about my future and their role in managing it. We need to talk about your long-term plans, Marcus announced during one of his visits to my house. You can't keep living in this big house by yourself forever. Can't keep living in this big house? Forever. As if my housing decisions were his to make rather than mine. I'm managing fine, I said. The house isn't too big, and I enjoy living here. But Mom, you're 68 years old, Rebecca chimed in. What happens when you get older and can't take care of yourself? When you get older and can't take care of yourself. They were already planning for my decline into helplessness, despite no evidence that such decline was imminent or inevitable. I'll deal with that if and when it becomes necessary, I replied. Right now I'm healthy and independent. You say that now, Marcus said in the patronizing tone he'd learned from his father. But these things sneak up on people. It's better to plan ahead. Plan ahead. Make decisions about my future based on their assumptions about my limitations, rather than my actual capabilities. Over the next 2 years, these conversations became increasingly frequent and condescending. Marcus and Rebecca had appointed themselves as my future caregivers and decision-makers, despite my consistent demonstration of competence and independence. They would visit my house and point out maintenance issues I should address. They would question my driving abilities and suggest I consider giving up my car. They would recommend doctors, financial advisors, and service providers as if I were incapable of making these decisions myself. Mom, you really should let us help you find a good financial advisor, Rebecca suggested during one visit. Managing money is complicated, especially for someone who's never done it before. Never done it before. My daughter had no idea that I'd been managing a complex investment portfolio worth over $600,000 for nearly 3 decades. I'm handling my finances just fine, I assured her. But Dad always took care of the money stuff, Rebecca persisted. You probably don't understand all the details. Don't understand all the details. If only she knew that I understood financial details far better than her father ever had. But what bothered me most about these interactions wasn't just their condescending assumptions. It was their complete lack of interest in learning who I really was or what I was actually capable of. They had formed an image of me as a simple, dependent woman who needed their guidance and protection. And they were determined to maintain that image regardless of any evidence to the contrary. When I mentioned taking a financial planning class at the community college, Marcus laughed dismissively. Mom, those classes are designed for people who are just starting to learn about money, he said. You don't need to complicate your situation with investment strategies you won't understand. Won't understand. Despite the fact that I'd been successfully implementing sophisticated investment strategies for longer than he'd been employed. When I talked about possibly traveling or pursuing new hobbies, Rebecca immediately focused on the risks and limitations. Be careful about spending too much money on travel, she warned. You need to make your savings last for the rest of your life. Make your savings last. She assumed I was living on limited resources that required careful rationing, never imagining that I had accumulated more wealth than she and her husband possessed. These attitudes became even more problematic when my children started making assumptions about their eventual inheritance and their role in my future care. When you're ready to sell the house, Rebecca and I can help you find a nice apartment or senior community, Marcus offered during one visit. We'll make sure you get a fair price and find someplace that's appropriate for your needs when you're ready to sell. As if the timing and circumstances of selling my house were decisions they would help me make rather than decisions I would make independently. We've been thinking about your will and estate planning, Rebecca announced during another conversation. You should probably update everything now that Dad's gone. Your will and estate planning. They were already planning how to inherit assets they assumed I possessed, without any actual knowledge of what those assets were or how I wanted to distribute them. But the most revealing moments came when they discussed their own financial situations in my presence. Conversations that showed they viewed me as a potential source of support rather than someone who might need support herself. The housing market is so expensive now, Marcus complained during one family dinner. Rebecca and I both wish we could afford bigger houses. But the prices are just crazy. Wish we could afford bigger houses. A subtle hint that perhaps their mother might help with such expenses, just as their father had helped with countless other costs over the years. My kids are going to need money for college in a few years, Rebecca mentioned casually. It's scary how expensive education has become. Going to need money for college. Another hint that grandmother might contribute to expenses that parents couldn't handle alone. These comments revealed that Marcus and Rebecca had learned nothing about financial independence or responsibility from their father's death. They were still expecting family members to solve financial problems they should have been addressing themselves. More troubling? They were already viewing me as a resource they might need to access in the future. Not a person with my own goals and priorities, but a potential source of financial support for their own plans and dreams. By 2018, 2 years after Robert's death, the pattern was clear. My children had no interest in knowing who I really was or what I was actually capable of. They had assigned me a role as dependent elderly mother, and they intended to maintain that role regardless of reality. They offered help I didn't need while assuming I couldn't handle responsibilities I'd been managing successfully for decades. They made plans for my future while ignoring my own preferences and capabilities. They treated me like a burden they were graciously willing to shoulder rather than a person deserving of respect and autonomy. But they also began showing signs of impatience with my independence, as if my refusal to conform to their image of helpless widowhood was somehow inconsiderate or unrealistic. "Mom, you're being stubborn about this," Marcus said when I declined his suggestion to hire a housekeeping service. "There's no shame in accepting help when you need it." Being stubborn. No shame in accepting help. As if my preference for maintaining my own household was a character flaw rather than a legitimate choice. "You're not as young as you used to be," Rebecca added. "It's okay to admit that some things are getting harder." Not as young as you used to be. Admit that some things are getting harder. They were determined to convince me that I was declining, even when I felt strong and capable. These interactions became increasingly frustrating and demoralizing. My own children were treating me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. They were planning my future without consulting me and offering solutions to problems I didn't have. But the most troubling aspect was their complete lack of curiosity about my actual life and capabilities. They never asked what I did with my time. They never wondered how I was managing financially. They never showed interest in my thoughts, goals, or experiences. They had reduced me to a stereotype of elderly widowhood, and they were determined to maintain that stereotype regardless of who I actually was. By 2020, when my secret investment accounts had grown to over $1.8 million, I was living with the strange reality of being financially independent while being treated as financially helpless by my own children. I could have afforded to travel anywhere in the world, but Marcus and Rebecca worried about me spending money on local trips. I could have bought a luxury car with cash, but they questioned whether I should continue driving at all. I could have made substantial charitable donations, but they assumed I needed to carefully conserve my limited resources. The disconnect between my actual situation and their perception of my situation was becoming almost surreal, but I maintained my silence about my true financial position because I was learning something important about my children's character, something that would prove crucial when they eventually pushed me too far. Marcus and Rebecca weren't offering help because they loved and respected me. They were positioning themselves as my future caregivers because they expected to inherit whatever assets I possessed when I died. Their concern about my welfare was directly connected to their assumptions about their eventual inheritance. They wanted to manage my life not to benefit me, but to protect resources they considered their own future property. This became clear during conversations about my will and estate planning. Have you thought about setting up trusts or other arrangements to minimize taxes on your estate? Marcus asked during one visit. Minimize taxes on your estate. He was already thinking about how to maximize what he and Rebecca would inherit, without any knowledge of what those inheritances might actually be. You should probably designate one of us as power of attorney, Rebecca suggested. Just in case something happens and you can't make decisions for yourself. Power of attorney. Legal authority to make decisions about my life and finances. They were already positioning themselves to take control if I became vulnerable. These suggestions weren't made out of concern for my welfare. They were made to protect their own interests in my eventual estate and to position themselves as my legal representatives if circumstances allowed. By 2022, the pattern was unmistakable. Marcus and Rebecca were treating me like an asset they needed to manage rather than a person they loved and respected. They were planning my future based on their assumptions about my limitations and their expectations about their inheritance. They offered help to demonstrate their role as dutiful children while privately planning how to benefit from my death. They expressed concern about my welfare while working to position themselves as my future decision-makers. Most importantly, they had no interest in knowing who I really was or what I was actually capable of accomplishing. That willful ignorance would prove to be the most expensive mistake they ever made, because the woman they were treating as a helpless dependent had built more wealth than they could imagine. The woman they were planning to manage and control had the resources to disappear completely whenever she chose. The woman they thought they knew was actually someone entirely different. Someone much smarter, much more capable, and much more independent than they had ever suspected. But they would never find out who their mother really was until it was too late to change how they'd treated her. The warning signs had been clear for years. The growing distance between us had been obvious to anyone who cared to notice. The condescending attitudes and presumptuous planning had revealed their true character. I had been patient for years, hoping they would mature into adults who could see me as a person rather than a responsibility. But by 2023, it was clear that patience wasn't going to change anything. Marcus and Rebecca had decided who they wanted me to be, and they were determined to force me into that role, regardless of reality. That determination would cost them everything when they finally pushed me beyond my breaking point. The woman they thought they could manage and control was about to show them exactly what happened when you underestimated Eleanor Blackwood. They had been warned. They just hadn't been smart enough to recognize the warnings. That Tuesday evening dinner at Marcus's house was the culmination of 7 years of condescending treatment, presumptuous planning, and willful blindness about who their mother really was. But it was also the beginning of the most expensive lesson my children would ever receive. Surprise ma classe. The conversation that changed everything started exactly as I'd expected. Marcus and Rebecca sitting across from me like judges preparing to deliver a verdict I had no choice but to accept. "Mom, we need to discuss your living situation," Marcus began with the tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news they think is actually good news. "Rebecca and I have been talking, and we're concerned about your future." Your future. As if my future was their decision to make, rather than mine to plan. "We've been researching senior living communities," Rebecca added, sliding a glossy brochure across the table toward me. "There are some really nice places that would be perfect for someone in your situation." Someone in your situation. A 70-year-old woman they assumed was barely managing to survive on limited resources. I looked at the brochure. Sunset Manor Senior Living. A sterile-looking facility with tiny apartments and communal dining rooms. The kind of place where people went to wait for death while pretending to be grateful for the privilege. "I'm not interested in moving to a senior community," I said calmly. That's when Marcus laughed, not a surprised laugh or an amused laugh. The dismissive laugh of someone whose opinion is the only one that matters. "Mom, you don't really have a choice here," he said. "You can't afford to keep living independently. Your Social Security barely covers basic expenses." Barely covers basic expenses. If only he knew that my monthly investment income exceeded his annual salary. Actually, I've been working on some retirement plans, I said, giving them one last chance to show interest in my actual capabilities and resources. Marcus's laugh became louder and crueler. Mom, you're 70 years old with arthritis. What retirement plans? You'll be living with us forever because you have nothing. You have nothing. Bulls hayadolitias lur. Those 3 words crystallized everything I'd endured for the past 7 years. Every condescending comment. Every presumptuous suggestion. Every dismissive attitude about my intelligence and capabilities. You have nothing. Marcus had just revealed exactly how little he knew about his mother, and exactly how little respect he had for the woman who'd sacrificed decades of her life to give him every advantage. We've already spoken with the manager at Sunset Manor, Rebecca continued, apparently unaware that her brother had just sealed their fate with his casual cruelty. They have a nice 1-bedroom unit available next month. The monthly fee is $1,800, which we can cover using the proceeds from selling your house. Using the proceeds from selling your house. They had already planned to liquidate my most valuable asset to pay for warehousing me in an institution I didn't want or need. And if I refuse? I asked. The look that passed between Marcus and Rebecca told me everything I needed to know. They had anticipated this scenario and prepared for it. Then we'll have to explore legal options, Marcus said with false sympathy. Guardianship proceedings. Power of attorney. Whatever it takes to ensure you receive appropriate care. Legal options. Guardianship proceedings. They were threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't surrender my independence voluntarily. You can't be serious, I said. We're completely serious, Rebecca replied. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Maybe it's early dementia. Maybe it's just age. But you can't keep pretending you have options you don't have. Early dementia. Because I'd suggested I had retirement plans they didn't know about. That's when I stood up from their dining room table and made the decision that would change all our lives forever. I think I should go home, I said. Mom, sit down, Marcus ordered. We're not done discussing this. Yes, we are, I said. This conversation is over. As I walked toward the front door, Marcus followed me with one final insult that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mom, don't be stubborn about this. You know we're right. I turned to look at my son one last time, this man I'd raised with such love and hope. This man who was now threatening to destroy my independence because he couldn't imagine that his mother might be more capable than he assumed. Marcus, I said quietly, you have no idea who you're dealing with. He laughed again. That same dismissive, cruel laugh that would echo in my memory forever. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a 70-year-old woman who can't accept reality. Can't accept reality. I left his house that night knowing I would never see Marcus or Rebecca again. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I was hurt, though I was. But because they had shown me exactly who they were, and I finally understood that they would never change. Okay. Hupki, he's I also as a key, but hupki, he port of b, see nights to their ills. Arpi carely or track. They would never see me as anything more than a burden to be managed. They would never respect my intelligence, independence, or autonomy. They would never acknowledge that their mother might have built something significant, while they assumed she was helpless. Most importantly, they would never apologize for treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The drive home from Marcus's house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Not because of distance, but because I was processing the end of relationships that had defined my identity for over 40 years. I was no longer Marcus and Rebecca's mother. I was no longer someone whose love and sacrifice would be appreciated or reciprocated. I was no longer willing to maintain connections with people who saw me as less than I was. I was Eleanor Blackwood again, the woman who'd lifted herself out of poverty through determination and intelligence. The woman who'd built substantial wealth through patience and strategic thinking. The woman who'd survived decades of being underestimated by people who should have known better. And I was about to disappear completely, sûrement. When I got home that night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list. A strategic plan for vanishing so thoroughly that Marcus and Rebecca would spend the rest of their lives wondering how they'd been so wrong about their mother. At the top of the page, I wrote, "How to disappear with $2.8 million. Because that's what I was going to do. I was going to liquidate every asset, close every account, and relocate to a place where my children would never find me. I was going to take the wealth they didn't know existed and build a new life where my intelligence and capabilities would be appreciated rather than dismissed. But first, I was going to let them experience the consequences of their assumptions." The next morning, I began executing the most comprehensive disappearance plan ever implemented by a supposedly helpless 70-year-old woman. I started with my financial accounts. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically liquidated my entire investment portfolio. $2.8 million converted to cash, and transferred 2 offshore accounts in jurisdictions that didn't cooperate with American investigators. I'd spent 37 years learning about international finance and investment strategies. I knew exactly how to move money without leaving traces that amateur investigators could follow. Next, I arranged the sale of my house. Not through local real estate agents who might mention the transaction to people who knew my children, but through a private investor who purchased properties for cash without requiring extensive documentation or public listings. The house sold for $340,000. Cash transaction closed within 10 days. Another substantial sum that would vanish along with me. I donated my furniture and personal belongings to various charities, keeping only what I could fit in 2 suitcases. Everything Marcus and Rebecca might have expected to inherit disappeared into the community that had actually appreciated my contributions over the years. But the most important part of my plan involved creating a new identity in a location my children would never think to search. I'd been researching international retirement communities for years, not because I'd planned to use the information, but because I found it intellectually interesting. I knew exactly where a wealthy American woman could relocate without attracting attention or generating paperwork that could be traced. Costa Rica had become home to thousands of American retirees who wanted to live comfortably on modest budgets. But it was also a perfect place for someone with substantial resources to live luxuriously while remaining completely anonymous. I purchased a beautiful house in the mountains outside San Jose. Cash transaction, completed through local attorneys who specialized in helping foreigners establish residency. The house had spectacular views, modern amenities, and most importantly, complete privacy from anyone who might come looking for Eleanor Blackwood. But I wasn't going to be Eleanor Blackwood anymore. My new identity was Eleanor Mitchell, my maiden name, with documentation that would satisfy any casual investigation. A widow from Pennsylvania, who'd decided to spend her retirement years enjoying the tropical climate and lower cost of living that Costa Rica offered. The transformation took 6 weeks to complete. 6 weeks during which Marcus and Rebecca had no idea their mother was systematically erasing herself from their lives. They called occasionally during this period, leaving voicemails that revealed they expected me to reconsider their plans for my future. "Mom, we've been thinking about our conversation," Rebecca's message said. "Maybe we were too aggressive about the timeline. Call us back so we can discuss some alternatives." Some alternatives. As if the problem was their timing rather than their complete lack of respect for my autonomy. "Mom, don't be stubborn about this," Marcus's message said. "We're trying to help you. Call us back so we can work out a reasonable plan. Reasonable plan. A plan that involved destroying my independence to satisfy their assumptions about my limitations." Wheezit. I didn't return their calls. I was too busy disappearing. Wheezy disappearing. On March 15th, exactly 6 weeks after that devastating dinner, I boarded a flight from Philadelphia to San Jose, Costa Rica. I carried 2 suitcases, a new passport, and financial resources that exceeded the GDP of small countries. I left behind a house that had been sold and emptied, bank accounts that had been closed and liquidated, a life that had been carefully dismantled and erased. Most importantly, I left behind 2 adult children who were about to discover that their assumptions about their mother had been catastrophically wrong. The first sign of their growing panic came 3 days after my departure. Marcus called my home phone repeatedly, getting increasingly agitated when I didn't answer. Then he drove to my house and discovered it was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no indication of where I might have gone. The voicemails he left that day revealed exactly how little he'd understood about his mother's capabilities. Mom, where are you? The house is empty. What's going on? Call me back immediately. What's going on was that the helpless woman he'd threatened with guardianship had outsmarted him completely. Over the next few days, Marcus and Rebecca's messages became increasingly desperate and angry. Mom, this isn't funny. We're worried about you. Call us back right now. Mom, you're scaring us. We've called the police. Where are you? Mom, we've hired a private investigator. Come home and we'll forget about the senior living discussion. Come home and we'll forget about the senior living discussion. As if the problem was their specific plan rather than their fundamental lack of respect for my intelligence and independence. But the most revealing message came a week after my disappearance, when they'd begun to understand the scope of what I'd accomplished. Mom, we found out about the house sale. We know you have more money than you told us about. We're sorry we underestimated your situation. Please call us back so we can fix this. We're sorry we underestimated your situation. Too little, too late. Too late. They weren't sorry they'd treated me with disrespect and condescension. They weren't sorry they'd threatened to have me declared incompetent. They weren't sorry they'd planned to control my life without consulting me. They were sorry they'd discovered their assumptions about my financial resources were wrong. They were sorry they'd lost access to wealth they'd never known existed. But their apology revealed that they still didn't understand what they'd done wrong. They thought the problem was their miscalculation of my financial situation, rather than their complete failure to see me as a person deserving of respect and autonomy. The messages continued for months. Angry demands, desperate pleas, legal threats, emotional manipulation. Everything except genuine acknowledgement of how badly they'd treated me. Marcus hired private investigators who traced my movements as far as Philadelphia International Airport, before losing the trail completely. Rebecca contacted banks, government agencies, and former friends, looking for clues about my whereabouts. But I'd been planning financial invisibility for 37 years. I knew how to disappear more thoroughly than amateur investigators could track. Meanwhile, I was settling into my new life in Costa Rica with a satisfaction that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. My house in the mountains was everything I'd dreamed about during decades of being underestimated and dismissed. Spacious rooms with spectacular views, a modern kitchen where I could cook whatever I wanted, a library where I could read without interruption, a garden where I could grow tropical flowers I'd only seen in pictures. I left his house that night knowing I would never see Marcus or Rebecca again. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I was hurt, though I was. But because they had shown me exactly who they were, and I finally understood that they would never change. They would never see me as anything more than a burden to be managed. They would never respect my intelligence, independence, or autonomy. They would never acknowledge that their mother might have built something significant while they assumed she was helpless. Most importantly, they would never apologize for treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The drive home from Marcus's house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Not because of distance, but because I was processing the end of relationships that had defined my identity for over 40 years. I was no longer Marcus and Rebecca's mother. I was no longer someone whose love and sacrifice would be appreciated or reciprocated. I was no longer willing to maintain connections with people who saw me as less than I was. I was Eleanor Blackwood again. The woman who'd lifted herself out of poverty through determination and intelligence. The woman who'd built substantial wealth through patience and strategic thinking. The woman who'd survived decades of being underestimated by people who should have known better. And I was about to disappear completely. You knew. When I got home that night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list. A strategic plan for vanishing so thoroughly that Marcus and Rebecca would spend the rest of their lives wondering how they'd been so wrong about their mother. At the top of the page I wrote, "How to disappear with $2.8 million, because that's what I was going to do. I was going to liquidate every asset, close every account, and relocate to a place where my children would never find me. I was going to take the wealth they didn't know existed and build a new life where my intelligence and capabilities would be appreciated rather than dismissed. But first, I was going to let them experience the consequences of their assumptions." The next morning, I began executing the most comprehensive disappearance plan ever implemented by a supposedly helpless 70-year-old woman. I started with my financial accounts. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically liquidated my entire investment portfolio. $2.8 million converted to cash and transferred to offshore accounts in jurisdictions that didn't cooperate with American investigators. I'd spent 37 years learning about international finance and investment strategies. I knew exactly how to move money without leaving traces that amateur investigators could follow. Next, I arranged the sale of my house. Not through local real estate agents who might mention the transaction to people who knew my children, but through a private investor who purchased properties for cash without requiring extensive documentation or public listings. The house sold for $340,000. Cash transaction, closed within 10 days. Another substantial sum that would vanish along with me. I donated my furniture and personal belongings to various charities, keeping only what I could fit in 2 suitcases. Everything Marcus and Rebecca might have expected to inherit disappeared into the community that had actually appreciated my contributions over the years. But the most important part of my plan involved creating a new identity in a location my children would never think to search. I'd been researching international retirement communities for years, not because I'd planned to use the information, but because I found it intellectually interesting. I knew exactly where a wealthy American woman could relocate without attracting attention or generating paperwork that could be traced. Costa Rica had become home to thousands of American retirees who wanted to live comfortably on modest budgets. But it was also a perfect place for someone with substantial resources to live luxuriously while remaining completely anonymous. I purchased a beautiful house in the mountains outside San Jose. Cash transaction, completed through local attorneys who specialized in helping foreigners establish residency. The house had spectacular views, modern amenities, and most importantly, complete privacy from anyone who might come looking for Eleanor Blackwood. But I wasn't going to be Eleanor Blackwood anymore. My new identity was Eleanor Mitchell, my maiden name, with documentation that would satisfy any casual investigation. A widow from Pennsylvania who'd decided to spend her retirement years enjoying the tropical climate and lower cost of living that Costa Rica offered. The transformation took 6 weeks to complete, 6 weeks during which Marcus and Rebecca had no idea their mother was systematically erasing herself from their lives. They called occasionally during this period, leaving voicemails that revealed they expected me to reconsider their plans for my future. "Mom, we've been thinking about our conversation," Rebecca's message said. "Maybe we were too aggressive about the timeline. Call us back so we can discuss some alternatives." Some alternatives. As if the problem was their timing rather than their complete lack of respect for my autonomy. "Mom, don't be stubborn about this," Marcus's message said. "We're trying to help you. Call us back so we can work out a reasonable plan." Reasonable plan. A plan that involved destroying my independence to satisfy their assumptions about my limitations. Tale. I didn't return their calls. I was too busy disappearing, Pale. On March 15th, exactly 6 weeks after that devastating dinner, I boarded a flight from Philadelphia to San Jose, Costa Rica. I carried 2 suitcases, a new passport, and financial resources that exceeded the GDP of small countries. I left behind a house that had been sold and emptied, bank accounts that had been closed and liquidated, a life that had been carefully dismantled and erased. Most importantly, I left behind 2 adult children who were about to discover that their assumptions about their mother had been catastrophically wrong. The first sign of their growing panic came 3 days after my departure. Marcus called my home phone repeatedly, getting increasingly agitated when I didn't answer. Then he drove to my house and discovered it was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no indication of where I might have gone. The voicemails he left that day revealed exactly how little he'd understood about his mother's capabilities. "Mom, where are you? The house is empty. What's going on? Call me back immediately." What's going on was that the helpless woman he'd threatened with guardianship had outsmarted him completely. Over the next few days, Marcus and Rebecca's messages became increasingly desperate and angry. Foddy. "Mom, this isn't funny. We're worried about you. Call us back right now." "Mom, you're scaring us. We've called the police. Where are you?" "Mom, we've hired a private investigator. Come home and we'll forget about the senior living discussion." "Come home and we'll forget about the senior living discussion." As if the problem was their specific plan rather than their fundamental lack of respect for my intelligence and independence. But the most revealing message came a week after my disappearance, when they'd begun to understand the scope of what I'd accomplished. "Mom, we found out about the house sale. We know you have more money than you told us about. We're sorry we underestimated your situation. Please call us back so we can fix this." "We're sorry we underestimated your situation." Too little, too late. They weren't sorry they'd treated me with disrespect and condescension. They weren't sorry they'd threatened to have me declared incompetent. They weren't sorry they'd planned to control my life without consulting me. They were sorry they'd discovered their assumptions about my financial resources were wrong. They were sorry they'd lost access to wealth they'd never known existed. But their apology revealed that they still didn't understand what they'd done wrong. They thought the problem was their miscalculation of my financial situation, rather than their complete failure to see me as a person deserving of respect and autonomy. The messages continued for months. Angry demands, desperate pleas, legal threats, emotional manipulation, everything except genuine acknowledgement of how badly they'd treated me. Marcus hired private investigators who traced my movements as far as Philadelphia International Airport before losing the trail completely. Rebecca contacted banks, government agencies, and former friends looking for clues about my whereabouts. But I'd been planning financial invisibility for 37 years. I knew how to disappear more thoroughly than amateur investigators could track. Meanwhile, I was settling into my new life in Costa Rica, with a satisfaction that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. My house in the mountains was everything I'd dreamed about during decades of being underestimated and dismissed. Spacious rooms with spectacular views. A modern kitchen where I could cook whatever I wanted. A library where I could read without interruption. A garden where I could grow tropical flowers I'd only seen in pictures. But more than the physical comfort, I was enjoying something I hadn't experienced in years. Respect. My new neighbors saw me as Eleanor Mitchell, a successful retired businesswoman who'd earned the right to live comfortably wherever she chose. They didn't know my history or make assumptions about my limitations. They treated me as an intelligent, capable adult whose opinions and decisions were worthy of respect. I joined a book club where my literary insights were appreciated. I volunteered with a local charity that helped American expatriates navigate Costa Rican bureaucracy. I took Spanish lessons and discovered I had a natural aptitude for languages. For the first time in decades, I was living as myself, rather than as someone else's limited perception of who I should be. I also started a new investment strategy focused on emerging markets and international opportunities. The $2.8 million I'd accumulated over 37 years was growing even faster in my new environment, where I had access to investment opportunities that weren't available to typical American retirees. By the end of my first year in Costa Rica, my net worth had grown to over $3.2 million. I was generating more monthly income from investments than most people earned in a year. But the most satisfying aspect of my new life wasn't the financial success or physical comfort. It was the knowledge that I'd proven something important about the power of being underestimated. Marcus and Rebecca had made the classic mistake of confusing visibility with capability. Because they couldn't see my wealth, they'd assumed I was poor. Because they couldn't see my intelligence, they'd assumed I was simple. Because they couldn't see my independence, they'd assumed I was dependent. Those assumptions had cost them everything they'd expected to inherit. More importantly, those assumptions had cost them any relationship with their mother. 2 years after my disappearance, I received information from a friend still living in Pennsylvania that Marcus and Rebecca were facing serious financial difficulties. Marcus had been laid off from his corporate job and was struggling to find comparable employment. Rebecca's husband had left her for a younger woman, leaving her with substantial legal bills and reduced household income. Both of them were dealing with exactly the kind of financial crises that parents typically help adult children navigate. The kind of crises that $3.2 million could have solved easily. But that money was no longer available to them. That money belonged to Eleanor Mitchell, a woman they'd never known and would never find. My children had spent years planning to manage their helpless mother's limited resources. Instead, they'd lost access to wealth that could have changed their lives because they'd been too arrogant to see who their mother really was. The irony was perfect. The woman they'd thought needed their financial guidance was living in luxury while they struggled with problems she could have solved effortlessly. But I felt no sympathy for their difficulties. They'd created their own situation through years of disrespect, condescension, and presumptuous planning. They'd chosen to see me as a burden rather than a person, and now they were living with the consequences of that choice. On the 3rd anniversary of my disappearance, I received a final message from Marcus through intermediaries who traced some of my previous financial activities. Mom, if you're reading this, please know that Rebecca and I understand we made mistakes. We're sorry for how we treated you. We want to make things right. Please contact us so we can repair our relationship. We want to make things right. But there was no way to make things right. The damage they'd done wasn't about specific incidents that could be apologized away. It was about fundamental character traits that had been revealed through years of behavior. Marcus and Rebecca had shown me that they were people who judged others based on assumptions rather than evidence. People who tried to control others rather than respect their autonomy. People who valued inheritance more than relationships. Those weren't mistakes that could be corrected through apologies. Those were character flaws that would shape how they treated people for the rest of their lives. I was better off without them. Today, I'm 73 years old and living the most satisfying life I've ever experienced. I have more money than I could spend in multiple lifetimes. I have a beautiful home in a place where I'm respected and appreciated. I have friends who value my intelligence and enjoy my company. Most importantly, I have complete freedom to live exactly as I choose without explaining my decisions to anyone or accepting anyone else's limitations on my possibilities. I spend my mornings reading books about subjects that interest me. I spend my afternoons working in my garden or volunteering with organizations that help people who've been underestimated by others. I spend my evenings cooking elaborate meals and enjoying wines I never could have afforded during my previous life. I travel whenever I want to places I've always dreamed of seeing. I take classes in subjects I never had time to study. I support causes that matter to me without worrying about anyone else's approval or understanding. I am living the life Eleanor Blackwood always deserved, but never had the freedom to pursue. The money Marcus and Rebecca thought didn't exist has given me complete independence from their opinions, their plans, and their assumptions about my limitations. The woman they thought they could control has proven that intelligence and determination can overcome any attempt at manipulation or domination. The mother they thought they knew has become someone entirely different. Someone who values respect over family obligation, autonomy over security, and truth over comfortable illusions. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus and Rebecca ever figured out how wrong they were about their mother. Whether they ever realized that the woman they'd dismissed as financially helpless had accumulated more wealth than they would ever possess. Whether they ever understood that their condescending attitudes and presumptuous planning had cost them not just an inheritance, but any relationship with someone who might have genuinely cared about their welfare. But mostly, I don't think about them at all, because the greatest gift of my disappearance hasn't been proving them wrong about my capabilities. It's been discovering who I could become when I stopped allowing other people's limitations to define my possibilities. I am Eleanor Mitchell now. A woman who chose freedom over family obligation. A woman who chose respect over relationships that required her to pretend to be less than she was. A woman who proved that it's never too late to start over when the people in your life can't see who you really are. My name is Eleanor Mitchell. I'm 73 years old. I live in the mountains of Costa Rica with more money than most people earn in several lifetimes. And I've never been happier. Marcus and Rebecca are still looking for their mother. They'll never find her, because she doesn't exist anymore. The woman they thought they knew was just a role I played for decades, while building the resources and knowledge that would eventually allow me to disappear completely. The woman they dismissed and underestimated proved that respect isn't optional in relationships, that family connections don't excuse bad behavior, that love without respect isn't worth maintaining. Most importantly, she proved that assumptions about other people's limitations usually reveal more about the person making those assumptions than the person being judged. Marcus laughed at my retirement plans. He said I had nothing. Now he knows exactly how wrong he was about everything. And I'm living exactly the retirement I planned, while he struggles with problems that $3.2 million could solve effortlessly. The woman who supposedly had nothing has everything she ever wanted. The children who thought they knew everything learned the most expensive lesson of their lives. Sometimes the best revenge is living so well that the people who wronged you realize exactly what they lost through their own arrogance and stupidity. The Suwanisi. I disappeared. But I didn't vanish. I just became who I was always meant to be when I stopped letting other people's limitations define my life. Once pale life.